Have you ever wondered what you'd do if you saw a child in danger? Would you run toward the threat or away from it? Most people like to think they'd be heroes, but when bullets start flying in broad daylight on a busy street, survival instinct usually wins. Except sometimes, just sometimes, someone does the impossible. Maya Chun pressed her back against the cold brick wall of the alley, clutching the thin blanket that had become her only possession. The October wind cut through the threadbare fabric of her jacket, and her stomach cramped with familiar hunger. 3 days since her last real meal. 2 weeks since she'd been forced from the last shelter when they ran out of space. 6 months since she'd fled Seattle with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate need to disappear. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to be warm, to be safe, to be Dr. Maya Chun, licensed clinical social worker with a corner office and patients who trusted her to help them rebuild their lives. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she'd read about in a book rather than actually been. That woman had believed in the system, in getting help, in trusting the right people to do the right thing. That woman had been naive. The sound of expensive leather shoes on wet pavement made her shrink further into the shadows. She'd learned to recognize the difference between someone walking with purpose who wouldn't notice her and someone looking for trouble. These footsteps were steady, confident, accompanied by a smaller set that skipped occasionally. A man and a child, moving through the narrow streets of Little Italy like they belonged here. Maya peered around the edge of the dumpster that had become her makeshift shelter. The man was tall, probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair and the kind of expensive suit that cost more than Maya had made in a month back when she had an income. His olive skin suggested Italian heritage, which made sense in this neighborhood. But it was the way he moved that caught her attention, the way he constantly scanned their surroundings while maintaining an easy conversation with the boy beside him. The child couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, with the same dark hair as the man and bright eyes that sparkled when he laughed at something his father said. They were speaking in rapid Italian, too fast for Maya to catch more than a word here and there. But the affection between them was unmistakable. A father and son, walking home from school based on the small backpack the boy carried. Normal people living normal lives in their normal world, completely unaware that a woman who'd once had her own normal life was watching them from behind a pile of garbage, trying to remember what it felt like to belong somewhere. Maya was about to retreat deeper into the alley when she heard the rumble of car engines, too many of them moving too fast for the narrow street. The father must have heard it too because he suddenly went rigid, his hand moving instinctively to pull the boy behind him. The first black sedan rounded the corner at dangerous speed, followed immediately by a second. Maya's blood went cold as she saw the rear windows rolling down, the metallic glint of weapons emerging. This wasn't a random drive-by. This was planned, coordinated, professional. And that little boy was directly in the line of fire. Time seemed to slow as Maya watched the scene unfold. The father was reaching inside his jacket, probably for his own weapon, but he wouldn't be fast enough. The boy stood frozen, confusion replacing the laughter that had lit his face moments before. The car windows were down now, gun barrels visible, and Maya could see the exact moment when the shooters took aim. In that crystalline instant, every rational thought in Maya's head screamed at her to stay hidden, to protect herself, to let someone else handle this nightmare. She was nobody, a homeless woman who could barely take care of herself, certainly not equipped to handle armed killers in broad daylight. Getting involved would probably mean dying, and what good would that do anyone? But looking at that child's face, seeing his innocent confusion as death approached, Maya couldn't stay frozen. She'd spent her entire career trying to protect children, trying to save them from the adults who hurt them. She'd failed to save herself when Derek's abuse escalated beyond what she could endure, failed to use the system she believed in to get the help she needed. She'd lost everything and everyone she cared about. But maybe, just maybe, she could save this one child. Maya launched herself from behind the dumpster, her body moving before her mind could catch up with the insanity of what she was doing. She sprinted across the street, ignoring the screech of brakes and shouts in Italian, focused only on reaching the boy before the bullets did. The first shot rang out just as she threw herself forward, wrapping her arms around the child and using her body to shield him from the attackers. She felt the impact of the first bullet, a burning sensation in her shoulder that sent shock waves through her entire system. The second hit her in the back, the third in her side, and the fourth somewhere in her leg, but she held tight to the boy, pressing him against the brick wall of a building and covering him completely with her body. Gunfire erupted around them, returned shots from the father, and what sounded like additional shooters who'd appeared from somewhere nearby. Maya heard shouting in Italian, the screech of tires, and the rapid pop of automatic weapons, but it all seemed distant and muffled, like she was listening from underwater. The boy was crying now, but he was alive. She could feel his small body shaking beneath her, could hear him calling for his papa in a voice thick with terror, but he was breathing and moving and alive. That was all that mattered. Nothing else mattered. Maya felt her strength draining away as blood soaked through her clothes, but she didn't let go. She couldn't let go. Not until she was certain the danger had passed. Not until she knew this innocent child would be safe. Her vision was starting to blur around the edges, and there was a strange ringing in her ears, but she forced herself to stay conscious, to keep her body between the boy and any remaining threats. The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had begun, replaced by an eerie silence that felt almost more dangerous than the shooting had been. Maya heard rapid footsteps approaching, multiple sets, intense despite her injuries. "Papa," the boy was crying, "Papa," and then strong hands were carefully moving Maya aside, gentle despite their obvious urgency. She found herself looking up into the most intense green-gray eyes she'd ever seen. The father's face was a mask of controlled rage and desperate concern as he quickly assessed both her injuries and his son's condition. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made it clear he was someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "Get the car," he snapped to someone Maya couldn't see. "Now, and call Dr. Benedetti. Tell him we're coming in hot with a civilian casualty." The man's hands moved over Maya's wounds with surprising gentleness, his touch professional and sure. She wanted to tell him she was fine, that he should focus on his son, but her voice seemed to have stopped working. All she could manage was a weak nod toward the boy. "He's okay," the man said, understanding her unspoken question. "You saved him. You saved my son." There was something in his voice when he said it, a depth of emotion that suggested this child meant more to him than just a normal father-son relationship. This was a man who had probably faced death many times, who lived in a world where violence was commonplace, but the thought of losing his boy had shaken him to his core. Maya tried to speak again, to ask if the shooters were gone, if it was really safe now, but darkness was creeping in at the edges of her vision. The last thing she remembered was the man lifting her with surprising care, his voice low and urgent as he spoke to his people, arranging her medical care with the same decisive authority he'd used to command the return gunfire. As consciousness slipped away, Maya felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The strange comfort of being someone else's responsibility, of having someone else take charge when she couldn't. It should have frightened her, this complete dependence on a stranger, but instead it felt like the first safe breath she'd taken since leaving Seattle. She'd thrown herself into danger to save a child she didn't know, and somehow, impossibly, she'd ended up being saved herself. Maya's first conscious thought was that she'd died and somehow ended up in the wrong afterlife. The bed beneath her was softer than anything she'd experienced in months, possibly years, and the sheets felt like they cost more than her entire wardrobe back when she'd had a wardrobe. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the Manhattan skyline, and the air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and fresh flowers rather than the garbage and desperation that had become her constant companions. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain shot through her shoulder, back, and leg. The movement sent a cascade of memories flooding back. The little boy's terrified face, the sound of gunfire, strong hands lifting her with unexpected gentleness. She'd been shot, multiple times, and somehow, impossibly, she was alive. The room around her looked like something from a magazine spread about luxury medical facilities. Everything was pristine white and chrome, from the state-of-the-art monitoring equipment to the leather recliner positioned beside her bed. Fresh orchids sat on the bedside table, their elegant purple blooms a stark contrast to the clinical setting, and Maya found herself wondering who had thought to add that touch of beauty to what was clearly a serious medical situation. A soft knock on the door interrupted her confused assessment of her surroundings, and Maya looked up to see a woman in scrubs entering with a warm smile. The nurse was probably in her 50s, with kind eyes and the sort of efficient gentleness that suggested years of experience dealing with traumatic injuries. "You're awake," the woman said, moving to check the monitors beside Maya's bed. "I'm Dr. Benedetti's head nurse, Rosa. How are you feeling?" "Like I was shot 4 times, Maya managed, her voice hoarse from whatever medications they'd given her. "Where am I?" "Mr. Torino's private medical facility," Rosa explained, adjusting something on the foredrip. "You've been unconscious for 2 days. The surgery went well, all the bullets removed cleanly, no major organ damage. You're very lucky." Lucky wasn't exactly the word Maya would have chosen, but she supposed it was better than dead. "Torino," she repeated, testing the name. "The man with the little boy?" Rosa's expression softened. "Luca, yes. He's been asking about you constantly. His father too, actually. Mr. Torino has been here every day, sometimes twice a day. I think you'll be seeing him soon." Before Maya could process what that meant, Rosa was gone, leaving her alone with questions that seemed to multiply faster than she could organize them. Private medical facility suggested money, serious money, the kind that could afford state-of-the-art equipment and around-the-clock specialized care. The sort of resources that didn't typically get deployed for random homeless women who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Unless, of course, that homeless woman had saved someone very important to the person with those resources. Maya was still trying to piece together the implications when another knock came at the door. This time, she recognized the voice that called out asking for permission to enter, that same authoritative tone that had taken command of the chaos after the shooting. Adriano Torino stepped into the room carrying a bouquet of white roses that probably cost more than Maya had spent on food in the past month. He was dressed more casually than she remembered from their violent first meeting, dark slacks and a button-down shirt that didn't quite hide what she suspected was a shoulder holster. His green-gray eyes found hers immediately, and she saw relief there, genuine and deep, as if her waking up had lifted some weight he'd been carrying. "You're awake," he said, and Maya heard something in his voice that she couldn't quite identify. Gratitude, certainly, but something more complex underneath it. "How are you feeling?" "Like I should probably ask what I've gotten myself into," Maya replied honestly. She watched his expression carefully, looking for any sign of threat or deception, but found only what appeared to be sincere concern. Adriano moved to place the roses beside the orchids, his movements careful and deliberate in the way of someone accustomed to being watched and evaluated. When he turned back to her, Maya could see the exhaustion in his face, the lines of stress around his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping much. "You saved my son's life," he said simply. "There isn't anything I wouldn't do to repay that debt." The words sent a chill through Maya that had nothing to do with her injuries. In her professional life, she'd worked with enough clients involved in dangerous situations to recognize the weight of obligation in his tone. This wasn't just gratitude. This was the kind of debt that created permanent connections between people, whether they wanted them or not. "I don't want anything," she said quickly. "I just saw a child in danger and reacted." Anyone would have done the same thing. "No," Adriano said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Anyone would not have done the same thing. You threw yourself between my son and 4 armed men without hesitation, without knowing who we were or what the situation was. You risked your life for a stranger's child." Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncomfortable with the intensity of his gratitude. She'd spent the last 6 months invisible, forgotten, dismissed by everyone from social workers to shelter staff to the police officers who'd moved her along when she'd tried to sleep in doorways. Being the focus of this level of attention felt overwhelming, especially from someone who clearly wielded significant power. "Who are you?" she asked, though part of her already suspected she didn't want to know the answer. Adriano was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those penetrating eyes. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. "My name is Adriano Torino. My family has been in import-export business in New York for 3 generations. We handle logistics for clients who value discretion and reliability." It was a skillfully crafted non-answer, the sort of explanation that sounded legitimate on the surface, while revealing absolutely nothing about why someone would stage a professional assassination attempt against a man walking his son home from school. Maya had heard similar explanations during her social work career, usually from clients whose family members had gotten involved with people who handled logistics that couldn't be discussed in polite company. Import-export, she repeated, letting skepticism color her voice. Among other things, Adriano admitted, and there was something almost like relief in his expression at not having to maintain the pretense. Does it matter? Maya considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, it would have mattered enormously. Dr. Maya Chun, licensed clinical social worker, would have had ethical obligations and legal responsibilities that would have made any association with organized crime completely impossible. She would have contacted the authorities, insisted on proper police protection, done everything by the book. But Dr. Maya Chun had tried doing everything by the book when Derek's abuse escalated from emotional manipulation to physical violence. She'd filed police reports that went nowhere, obtained restraining orders that Derek ignored, sought help from the very system she'd spent her career supporting. The book had failed her completely, leaving her homeless and hunted while her abuser faced no consequences whatsoever. I don't know, Maya said finally. I'm not sure I'm in a position to be particular about the moral complexities of my rescuers. Something shifted in Adriano's expression, a softening around his eyes that suggested he understood more about moral compromise than she might have expected. Before he could respond, another knock came at the door, and Maya looked up to see the little boy from the shooting peering around the doorframe with obvious excitement. Papa, can I come in? Is she awake? Adriano's entire demeanor changed when he looked at his son, his face lighting with unconditional love. Come in, Luca. But quietly, she's still healing. The boy approached Maya's bed with the sort of careful reverence usually reserved for extremely fragile objects. He couldn't have been more than 8, with his father's dark hair and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. In his hands, he carried what appeared to be a homemade card, complete with crayons and glitter. I made this for you, Luca said, holding out the card with shy pride. To say thank you for saving me from the bad men. Maya accepted the card with hands that weren't quite steady, her throat tight with unexpected emotion. The front featured a stick figure drawing of a woman with long dark hair standing between a small boy and some very angry-looking figures with what appeared to be guns. Inside, in careful second-grade handwriting, he'd written, "Thank you for being brave. You are my hero." It's beautiful, Maya managed, her voice thick. Thank you, Luca. The little boy beamed at her praise, then looked at his father with obvious excitement. Can she come home with us, Papa? Rosa says she's getting better, and our house is really big. She could have her own room and everything. Maya felt her chest tighten with something that might have been longing if she'd allowed herself to feel such things. The casual way Luca spoke of their house being big, of having spare rooms to offer, reminded her sharply of everything she'd lost. Not just the material possessions, though those were gone too, but the sense of belonging somewhere, of being part of something larger than her own survival. We'll see, Adriano told his son gently. The lady needs to get better first, and then we'll figure out what's best for everyone. But Maya could see in his eyes that he'd already made up his mind, that the offer was real and non-negotiable as far as he was concerned. The debt he felt toward her wasn't something that could be repaid with flowers and medical care. It required something more substantial, more permanent. Later, after Luca had been coaxed away with promises of gelato and Adriano had left to handle what he called business matters, Maya lay in the expensive bed and tried to process what her life had become. 3 days ago, she'd been sleeping behind dumpsters and wondering how long she could survive on the streets. Now she was recovering in a luxury medical facility as the honored guest of a man who was almost certainly a member of organized crime. The rational part of her mind, the part trained in social work and ethical decision-making, insisted this was dangerous territory. Getting involved with people who solved problems with gunfire was exactly the opposite of what she needed while trying to rebuild her life. She should thank them politely, accept whatever financial assistance they offered, and then disappear before she got pulled deeper into a world she didn't understand. But the card from Luca sat on her bedside table beside the expensive flowers, a reminder that sometimes the most important decisions weren't about what was smart or safe or professionally appropriate. Sometimes they were about a little boy who looked at her like she was a hero, and a man whose gratitude ran so deep that he was prepared to rearrange his entire life to accommodate her. Maya had spent 6 months learning that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, that she could survive things that would have destroyed the woman she used to be. Maybe it was time to find out if she was also brave enough to let someone take care of her, even if it meant stepping into a world where the rules were written in blood and family loyalty trumped every other consideration. Dr. Benedetti appeared the next morning with her discharge papers and strict instructions about wound care, physical therapy, and follow-up appointments. Maya listened carefully to everything he said, while trying not to think about the fact that she had nowhere to go and no way to pay for any of the recommended treatment. That problem was solved when Adriano returned, his presence filling the room with the same quiet authority she'd noticed during their first meeting. He listened to the doctor's instructions with the focused attention of someone accustomed to handling complex logistics, asking detailed questions about recovery timelines and potential complications. "She'll be staying at my home during her recovery," he informed Dr. Benedetti, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request for approval. "I'll ensure she has everything she needs." Maya opened her mouth to protest, to insist that she could manage on her own, but the words died when she met Adriano's eyes. There was something implacable there, a determination that suggested arguing would be both pointless and potentially insulting given what she'd done for his family. Besides, where exactly would she go? Back to the alley where they'd met? To another shelter that might or might not have space? She had no money, no identification beyond what was left of her driver's license, no resources except the debt of gratitude owed by a man who clearly had the means to help her. Maybe, just this once, she could let someone else handle the logistics of keeping her safe. The penthouse was massive in a way that made Maya feel simultaneously grateful and completely out of place. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Manhattan that probably cost more per month than most people made in a year, and every piece of furniture looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. The guest room Adriano had given her was larger than the entire studio apartment she'd shared with her sister back in college, complete with its own marble bathroom and a walk-in closet that currently housed exactly 2 sets of clothes someone had thoughtfully purchased in her size. Maya stood at the window on her 3rd morning in his home, watching the city wake up far below while trying to reconcile her current reality with where she'd been just a week ago. The bandages on her wounds were smaller now, the pain manageable with over-the-counter medication, and her body was healing with the efficiency that came from proper medical care, adequate nutrition, and actual sleep in a real bed. The psychological adjustment was proving more difficult. She'd spent 6 months learning to be invisible, to take up no space, to want nothing and expect less. Now she was living in luxury that exceeded anything she'd experienced even during her previous professional life, surrounded by people who seemed genuinely concerned about her comfort and recovery. It felt surreal, like she was playing a role in someone else's life rather than actually living her own. The smell of coffee and something that might have been fresh bread drifted under her door, and Maya realized that Adriano was probably in the kitchen preparing breakfast. It had become a routine over the past few days, him cooking while Luca chattered about school and homework, and both of them including her in their conversation as if she'd always been part of their morning ritual. Maya pulled on one of the soft sweaters that had appeared in her closet and made her way toward the kitchen, following the sound of father and son discussing the proper way to fold napkins. The scene that greeted her was so domestic, so normal, that it made her chest tight with emotions she wasn't ready to examine too closely. Adriano stood at the massive stove wearing dark slacks and a white dress shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were stronger than she'd expected from someone who supposedly worked in import-export. He moved around the kitchen with the same confident efficiency he brought to everything else, flipping what appeared to be fresh crepes, while simultaneously helping Luca with his math homework. "Good morning," he said when he noticed her in the doorway, his smile warm and genuine. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Maya replied, which was true physically if not emotionally. The wounds were healing well, and the constant exhaustion that had plagued her for months was finally starting to fade thanks to regular meals and actual rest. Luca looked up from his homework with excitement. "Maya, Papa made crepes with the berries you said you liked. And look, I got all my multiplication problems right." "That's wonderful," Maya said, settling into the chair that had somehow become hers at the large dining table. "You're getting so good at math." She watched Adriano plate the crepes with the same attention to detail he seemed to bring to everything in his life, adding fresh berries and a light dusting of powdered sugar in a pattern that belonged in a restaurant rather than a family breakfast. It occurred to her that he'd been listening when she'd mentioned liking blueberries during a casual conversation the day before, filing away that small preference and acting on it. When had anyone last paid attention to what she liked? The breakfast conversation flowed easily around topics like Luca's upcoming school play and weekend plans for visiting his grandmother, but Maya found herself studying Adriano when she thought he wasn't looking. There were layers to him that didn't quite fit the image of a legitimate businessman, details that suggested a man accustomed to violence and command even in domestic settings. The way his eyes constantly tracked movement around the room, how he positioned himself with clear sight lines to both the entrance and the windows, the fact that his phone buzzed constantly with messages he read immediately before responding with brief, decisive replies. This wasn't a man who simply handled logistics for import companies. This was someone who lived with the constant awareness that danger could arrive at any moment. After Luca left for school with his bodyguard, whose presence was explained as a driver, but who Maya had noticed carried himself like military or police, Adriano returned to find her clearing the breakfast dishes. "You don't need to do that," he said gently. "Rosa comes in to handle the cleaning." "I need to do something," Maya replied, surprised by the frustration in her own voice. "I can't just sit here being taken care of like some kind of invalid princess." Adriano studied her face with those penetrating eyes, and Maya had the uncomfortable feeling that he was reading more in her expression than she intended to reveal. "You're still recovering from multiple gunshot wounds," he said finally. "Taking time to heal isn't being an invalid." Before Maya could respond, his phone buzzed again, and this time his expression darkened as he read the message. She watched him type a brief reply, his jaw tight with what looked like controlled anger. "Business," he said by way of explanation, but something in his tone suggested this particular business was more personal than usual. Over the following days, Maya began to understand what Adriano's world actually looked like. Men in expensive suits appeared at irregular intervals for meetings conducted in rapid Italian behind the closed doors of his home office. These weren't the casual business discussions she might have expected from legitimate import-export work. They were intense, strategic conversations punctuated by long silences and the occasional voice raised in what sounded like argument. Maya caught glimpses of these meetings when she passed through the hallway, and what she saw confirmed her growing suspicions about the true nature of Adriano's work. The men who came to see him carried themselves like soldiers, their posture alert and their eyes constantly scanning for threats. They spoke to Adriano with the kind of deference reserved for someone very high in whatever hierarchy they served, and they left with the sort of purposeful urgency that suggested orders had been given and would be carried out immediately. But it was the way Adriano handled himself during these meetings that really caught Maya's attention. The gentle man who cooked breakfast and helped his son with homework transformed into someone else entirely when conducting business. His voice carried absolute authority. His decisions were made quickly and without consultation, and his presence dominated the room in a way that left no doubt about who was in charge. Maya found herself oddly fascinated rather than frightened by this glimpse into his professional life. There was a code operating in his world, rules and boundaries that governed behavior even in what was clearly a dangerous environment. She heard him refuse certain jobs, insist on specific protections for civilians, demand guarantees that families would be kept safe from retaliation. Whatever else he might be, Adriano Torino was not a man who hurt innocent people. It was during one of these business meetings that Maya first realized someone might be watching the building. She'd been reading in the living room when movement on the street below caught her attention, a figure that seemed to be lingering too long near the entrance to Adriano's building. At first she dismissed it as coincidence, but when she looked again an hour later, the man was still there, now positioned behind a parked car with a clear view of anyone entering or leaving. The figure was too far away for her to make out details, but something about his posture, the way he held his shoulders, sent a chill of recognition through her. She'd spent 2 years learning to identify Derek's silhouette from a distance, developing the survival skill of spotting her abuser before he spotted her. Maya moved away from the window with her heart racing, telling herself she was being paranoid. that there was no way Derek could have found her here. She'd been careful to avoid using her real name at hospitals, had given false information whenever possible, had done everything she could think of to stay invisible. But Derek was persistent when he wanted something, and he had resources she'd never fully understood during their relationship. Friends in law enforcement who helped him track her previous attempts to disappear, contacts in the medical community who could access patient records, a network of people who owed him favors and were willing to ask questions on his behalf. Maya spent the rest of the day trying to convince herself she was imagining things, but when she looked out the window that evening, a different figure was positioned across the street, this one with better concealment but the same purposeful surveillance posture. Someone was definitely watching Adriano's building, and Maya was terribly afraid she knew why. She was debating whether to say anything to Adriano when she found him in his study late that night, sitting behind a massive desk with papers spread before him and a glass of what looked like expensive whiskey in his hand. The room was decorated in dark wood and leather, with built-in bookcases that stretched from floor to ceiling and artwork that suggested either exceptional taste or unlimited budget. Adriano looked up when she appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from business focus to genuine pleasure at seeing her. "Can't sleep?" he asked, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Something like that," Maya replied, settling into the leather chair that was probably more comfortable than most people's beds. "I didn't want to disturb you." "You're not disturbing me," Adriano said, closing the folder he'd been reading and giving her his full attention. "Just reviewing some logistics for tomorrow. Nothing that can't wait." Maya looked around the study, taking in the expensive furnishings and the subtle details that spoke of serious money and sophisticated taste. The books on the shelves were an interesting mix of business texts, classic literature, and what appeared to be several volumes on military strategy. On his desk, partially hidden under other papers, she caught a glimpse of what looked like surveillance photographs. "This must be very different from what you're used to," Adriano said, following her gaze around the room. "Different doesn't begin to cover it," Maya admitted. 6 months ago, I was sleeping in doorways and eating whatever I could find. Now I'm living in a penthouse that's probably worth more than most people see in a lifetime." "What happened?" Adriano asked gently. "How did you end up on the streets?" Maya was quiet for a long moment, debating how much to reveal. She'd gotten good at deflecting personal questions during her months of homelessness, but something about the late hour and Adriano's patient attention made her want to tell the truth. "I used to be a social worker," she said finally. "Dr. Maya Chun, licensed clinical social worker with a practice in Seattle specializing in domestic abuse recovery. I thought I was good at helping people, thought I understood the system and how to make it work for people who needed help." "Used to be," Adriano repeated, and she heard no judgment in his voice, only careful attention. "I was in a relationship with someone who turned out to be very good at manipulation and control," Maya continued, surprised by how steady her voice remained. "Derek Martinez. He's a police detective, well-connected, well-liked by his colleagues and supervisors. When things escalated to physical abuse, I did everything I was supposed to do. Filed reports, got restraining orders, documented everything, sought help through proper channels." Adriano's expression darkened, but he didn't interrupt. "Nothing worked," Maya said simply. "Derek knew how to work the system better than I did, knew which judges to approach and which colleagues would vouch for his character. Every time I tried to get help, he managed to make me look like the unstable one. Finally, he made it clear that staying in Seattle would mean escalating violence, and I realized the system I'd spent my career believing in wasn't going to save me." "So you ran," Adriano said, understanding in his voice. "I fled," Maya corrected, "with nothing but the clothes I was wearing and whatever cash I could scrape together. I've been moving ever since, trying to stay invisible, trying to stay alive." Adriano was quiet for a long moment, his green-gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable but instead felt oddly comforting. When he spoke, his voice carried the same authority she'd heard him use with his business associates. "He won't find you here," Adriano said, and there was absolute certainty in his tone. "You're under my protection now, and I don't let people hurt what's mine." The possessive language should have raised red flags, should have reminded her of Derek's controlling behavior, but somehow it didn't feel threatening coming from Adriano. Instead, it felt like a promise, like safety she'd forgotten existed. Maya rose to leave, not trusting herself to respond to his declaration without revealing how desperately she wanted to believe him. As she moved toward the doorway, she stopped beside one of the bookcases, drawn by a leather-bound volume of poetry that looked out of place among the business and strategy texts. "Neruda," she said, surprised. "I wouldn't have expected you to read love poetry." Adriano stood and moved to join her beside the bookshelf, close enough that she could smell his cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his body. "My wife gave me that book," he said quietly. "She said every man who wanted to understand women should read Neruda." "Wife," Maya repeated, realizing she'd never considered that he might be married. The thought sent an unexpected stab of something that might have been jealousy through her chest. "She died 3 years ago," Adriano said, his voice carefully controlled. "Car accident. Luca was 5. "I'm sorry," Maya said, meaning it. "That must have been devastating for both of you." "She was everything good in my world," Adriano replied, reaching past Maya to pull the book from the shelf. "After she died, I thought that was it for me, that I'd had my chance at happiness and lost it." He handed her the book, and when their fingers brushed as she accepted it, Maya felt an electric shock of awareness that had nothing to do with static electricity. The touch lingered longer than necessary, both of them seeming reluctant to break the contact. And when Maya looked up to meet Adriano's eyes, she saw something there that made her breath catch. He was looking at her like she was something precious, something worth protecting, something he wanted to keep close. It was the kind of look she'd convinced herself she'd never receive again, the kind of attention that made her remember she was still a woman capable of inspiring desire in a man worth having. Maya pulled her hand back carefully, clutching the book against her chest like armor. "Thank you for sharing this with me," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "Thank you for saving my son," Adriano replied, but his eyes were saying something entirely different, something about new possibilities and second chances and the unexpected gift of finding someone worth risking everything to protect. Maya escaped to her room with her heart racing and the taste of possibility on her lips, the book of poetry pressed against her chest like a talisman. Whatever was happening between them was dangerous territory for a woman still healing from abuse, still learning to trust her own judgment about men. But as she settled into the impossibly comfortable bed and opened to a random page of Neruda's passionate verses, Maya found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she was brave enough to find out what it felt like to be cherished by a man who had the power to keep his promises. Maya discovered that helping an 80-year-old build a volcano for his science project was simultaneously the most normal and most terrifying thing she'd done in months. Normal because it reminded her of why she'd gone into social work in the first place, the simple joy of watching a child learn and grow and succeed. Terrifying because of how right it felt, how easily she'd slipped into this maternal role that she'd convinced herself she'd never have the chance to experience. Luca sat beside her at the massive dining table, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration as he carefully painted the papier-mâché mountain they'd constructed over the past 2 days. His school clothes had been replaced with play clothes that still probably cost more than Maya's entire wardrobe, but he approached the messy project with the same enthusiasm any child would show. "Do you think it looks real?" Luca asked, holding up his brush to examine his handiwork. "Mrs. Peterson said it needs to look like a real volcano from Hawaii." "It looks perfect," Maya assured him, and she meant it. They'd spent hours researching volcanic formations online, looking at pictures of actual Hawaiian volcanoes, and discussing the science behind eruptions. Luca was brilliant, asking questions that showed he understood not just the mechanics, but the wonder of how the Earth worked. Maya had found herself thinking about what it would be like to help him with homework every night, to be part of his daily routine of discoveries and achievements and small childhood dramas. The thought was dangerous because it made her want things she had no right to want, made her imagine a future that belonged to someone else. She was so focused on helping Luca add realistic lava flows that she didn't notice Adriano watching from the doorway until Luca called out to him with excitement. "Papa, look. Maya showed me how to make it look like real lava, and tomorrow we get to make it explode with baking soda and vinegar." Adriano moved closer to examine their work, his presence immediately filling the space around the table. Maya found herself hyper-aware of his proximity, the way his cologne mixed with the scent of paint and the warmth of his body as he leaned over to admire their creation. "This is incredible," Adriano said, genuine appreciation in his voice as he studied the detailed volcano. "You two make a good team." There was something in his tone when he said it, something that made Maya look up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. His green-gray eyes held warmth and something deeper, something that looked almost like longing. Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked away quickly, focusing on cleaning paintbrushes to avoid the intensity of his gaze. She'd been living in his home for over a week now, and every day brought moments like this, small interactions that felt charged with possibility she wasn't sure how to handle. The sound of the elevator arriving interrupted her confused thoughts, and Maya looked up to see a small, elegant woman emerging with the sort of regal bearing that suggested she was accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Her silver hair was styled perfectly, her dark suit was clearly designer, and her sharp eyes immediately found and assessed Maya with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades evaluating people. "Nana!" Luca shrieked with delight, abandoning his paintbrush to launch himself at the woman who caught him in a hug that spoke of deep affection despite her formal appearance. "Hello, my darling boy," the woman said, her accent carrying just a hint of Italian vowels. "Show me what you're working on." "This is Maya," Luca announced proudly, tugging his grandmother toward the table. "She's helping me with my volcano project, and she knows everything about science, and she makes the best hot chocolate, and Papa says she's very brave." Maya stood awkwardly, suddenly conscious of the paint stains on her clothes and the fact that she probably looked like exactly what she was, a homeless woman who'd been given charity by this family. She started to introduce herself, but the older woman waved her silent with a gesture that was somehow both dismissive and welcoming. "I am Lucia Torino," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Adriano's mother and this little angel's grandmother. And you are the woman who saved my grandson's life." Maya shook the offered hand, surprised by the strength of the older woman's grip. "I'm Maya Chun, and I just did what anyone would have done." "Nonsense," Lucia said briskly, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Maya's appearance and demeanor. "Anyone would not have thrown themselves between armed men and a child they didn't know. You have courage, which is admirable, and good instincts with children, which is even more valuable." Before Maya could respond to that loaded statement, Lucia turned to her son with the sort of look that suggested years of unspoken communication between them. "Walk with me, Adriano," she said, and it wasn't a request. Maya watched them move to the far end of the living room, where they spoke in rapid Italian that was too quiet for her to follow even if she'd understood the language. But she could read body language well enough to see that Lucia was making some sort of point that Adriano was listening to with patient resignation, and that both of them occasionally glanced in her direction. "They like each other," Luca said matter-of-factly, returning to his painting as if family politics were a normal part of volcano construction. "Nana always talks to Papa like that when she thinks he should pay attention to something important." "What kind of important things?" Maya asked, curious despite herself. "Grown-up things," Luca replied with the dismissive tone children used for adult complications they didn't understand. "But she likes you. I can tell because she's not using her scary voice." Maya was processing this insight when her phone buzzed with a text message. She'd been getting random spam texts for days, but this one made her blood run cold. "I know where you are now. You can't hide behind your new boyfriend forever." The phone slipped from Maya's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering onto the table beside Luca's artwork. She stared at the screen, her heart racing as the implications sank in. Derek had found her. Somehow, despite all her precautions, despite Adriano's security, her abuser had tracked her down. "Maya?" Luca's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you okay? You look funny." Maya forced herself to pick up the phone and delete the message before Luca could see it, her hands shaking as she tried to appear calm. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just remembered something I need to tell your father." She looked across the room to where Adriano was still deep in conversation with his mother, debating whether to interrupt them with news that would probably result in increased security measures and questions she wasn't ready to answer. The thought of Derek's presence contaminating this safe space made her feel physically ill. Before she could decide what to do, the building's security system emitted a sharp beep that made everyone look toward the elevator. Adriano was moving before the sound fully registered, his hand going automatically to what Maya now realized was definitely a concealed weapon. The intercom crackled to life with a voice Maya recognized as belonging to the building's security guard. "Mr. Torino, we've got someone trying to access the building without authorization. Claims he's NYPD looking for a missing person, but his credentials don't check out. Should we call the real police?" Maya's blood turned to ice as she realized Derek had escalated from surveillance to direct confrontation. He'd tried to use his police identity to gain access to the building, probably planning to tell some story about a welfare check or missing person report that would get him past security. Adriano's eyes found hers immediately, and she saw understanding dawn in his expression as he read the fear in her face. Without hesitation, he moved to the intercom. "Hold him there, but don't engage physically," Adriano instructed, his voice carrying absolute authority. "I'm sending additional security down, and yes, call NYPD to verify his credentials. If he's really police, he won't mind the verification." Maya felt Lucia's sharp eyes studying her as the full implications of the situation became clear. This wasn't just a random security issue. This was about her, about the danger she'd brought into their home. "Luca," Adriano said gently, "why don't you take Nana to the kitchen and show her how Maya taught you to make hot chocolate?" "But what about my volcano?" Luca protested. "We'll finish it later," Maya managed, forcing her voice to sound normal despite the panic rising in her chest. "Go with your grandmother, okay?" After Lucia efficiently shepherded Luca away with promises of hot chocolate and cookies, Adriano turned to Maya with an expression that was part concern and part carefully controlled anger. "How long has he been trying to contact you?" Adriano asked, his voice deceptively calm. This was the first direct message, Maya admitted, pulling out her phone to show him the text. "But I think he's been watching the building. I saw someone a couple of days ago, and I thought it might be him, but I wasn't sure." Adriano's jaw tightened as he read Derek's message, and when he looked up, Maya saw something dangerous flickering in his green-gray eyes. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" "Because I hoped I was wrong," Maya said, defensive. "Because I didn't want to bring my problems into your home. Didn't want to put Luca in more danger because of me. You think I can't handle one corrupt cop who likes to hurt women?" Adriano asked, and there was steel in his voice that reminded Maya of exactly who she was dealing with. "I think you have enough problems without adding my stalker ex-boyfriend to the list," Maya replied, frustrated by her own helplessness. "I think I should leave before this gets worse, before he escalates to something that puts your family at risk." Adriano moved closer, close enough that Maya had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but absolutely certain. "You're not leaving," he said. "Not because of him, not because you're afraid. He doesn't get to drive you away from the first safe place you've found." Maya felt tears threaten at the certainty in his voice, at the way he spoke about her safety, as if it were his personal responsibility. She'd spent 2 years believing that no one would ever stand between her and Derek's abuse, that she was fundamentally alone in the world. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why does it matter to you what happens to me?" Adriano's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking gently across her skin in a gesture so tender it made her chest ache. "Because you matter to Luca," he said simply. "Because you saved his life and became part of our family. Because when I watch you with him, I see the mother he's never had." Maya's breath caught at his words, at the implication of permanent belonging they carried. But there was something else in his expression, something deeper than gratitude or family obligation. "And because you matter to me," Adriano continued, his voice dropping to an intimate register that made her skin warm. "More than you should, more than is probably smart given everything you're dealing with. But I can't seem to help myself." The honesty in his admission made Maya's heart race, made her want things she'd convinced herself she was too damaged to deserve. When he looked at her like that, like she was something precious rather than something broken, she could almost believe that Derek hadn't destroyed her capacity for trust and love. "I'm not good at this anymore," Maya said, her voice unsteady. "I don't know how to trust my own judgment about people, especially men. Derek spent 2 years convincing me that I was crazy, that I couldn't trust my own perceptions about anything." Adriano's thumb continued its gentle stroking across her cheek, his touch anchoring her to the present moment. "What do your instincts tell you about me?" he asked quietly. Maya looked into his green-gray eyes, searching for any sign of the manipulation she'd learned to recognize from Derek. Instead, she found patience and genuine concern, a willingness to let her set the pace and make her own decisions. "They tell me you're dangerous," Maya said honestly. "But not to me. Not to people you care about. And they tell me you've been lonely," she continued, surprised by her own boldness. "That losing your wife left a hole in your life that you haven't known how to fill. That you want someone who will love Luca as much as you do." Adriano's expression softened at her perceptive reading of his situation. "You see too much," he said, but there was admiration in his voice rather than discomfort. "I spent my career learning to read people," Maya replied, "to see what they needed, what they feared, what they hoped for." "And what do you see when you look at me?" Adriano asked, his hand still cradling her face with infinite gentleness. "I see a man who would do anything to protect his family," Maya said softly, "who rules a dangerous world but never lets that darkness touch his son, who cooks breakfast every morning and helps with homework and reads bedtime stories because being a father is the most important job you'll ever have." She paused, gathering courage for the rest of her observation. "And I see someone who makes me feel safe enough to want things I thought I'd never want again." The admission hung between them, charged with possibility and the weight of everything they'd both lost. Adriano's eyes darkened as he processed her words, and Maya saw the exact moment when his careful control began to slip. "Maya," he said, her name a rough whisper that made her pulse quicken. He was leaning closer, close enough that she could feel his breath against her lips, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his green-gray eyes. This was the moment, she realized, when everything would change between them, when they would cross from gratitude and friendship into something infinitely more complicated and dangerous. Maya let her eyes flutter closed, her lips parting slightly in invitation, every nerve in her body focused on the anticipation of his kiss. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted to find out if the connection she felt was real or just the product of her desperate need for safety and affection. "Papa?" Luca's voice cut through the charged atmosphere like a knife, followed immediately by the sound of small feet running toward them. Adriano stepped back immediately, his hand dropping from Maya's face as he turned toward his son with the sort of instant attention that never failed to impress her. Maya pressed her fingers to her cheek where his touch lingered, her heart still racing from their interrupted moment. "I had a bad dream," Luca announced, launching himself into his father's arms with the complete trust of a child who'd never doubted his safety. "There were bad men again, and they were trying to take Maya away." Adriano caught his son easily, his expression shifting to paternal concern as he rubbed Luca's back soothingly. "It was just a dream, buddy. Maya's safe, and no one is going to take her anywhere." "But what if they try?" Luca asked, his young face serious with worry. "What if the bad men come back?" "Then I'll stop them," Adriano said with absolute certainty. "Just like I did before. That's my job, taking care of you and Maya and everyone in our family." Maya's heart clenched at hearing herself included so naturally in Adriano's definition of family, at the way he spoke about protecting her as if it were a given rather than a burden. Watching him comfort his frightened son with such tenderness, she realized that her feelings for him had moved far beyond gratitude or even attraction. She was falling in love with Adriano Torino, despite every rational reason why that was dangerous for both of them. And for the first time in 2 years, the thought of loving someone didn't terrify her nearly as much as the thought of losing the chance to find out what that love might become. Maya should have known that Derek would choose the one moment she let her guard down to make his move. She'd been living in Adriano's protected world for 2 weeks, growing comfortable with the routine of safety, almost believing that his security measures were enough to keep the past at bay. The trip to the pharmacy should have been simple. 15 minutes to pick up antibiotics for Luca's ear infection while Adriano handled an urgent business call. She'd insisted on going alone despite Adriano's reluctance, needing to prove to herself that she could handle a simple errand without constant protection. The building's security had cleared her exit, the street had seemed normal, and for those precious few minutes of normalcy, Maya had almost felt like a regular person running regular errands for her family. That illusion shattered the moment Derek's hand clamped over her mouth from behind, his other arm wrapping around her waist with the bruising force she remembered too well. The familiar scent of his cologne, aggressive and suffocating, sent her body into immediate panic even as her mind struggled to process what was happening. "Hello, Maya," Derek whispered against her ear, his voice carrying the same reasonable tone he'd used while destroying her life systematically. "Miss me?" Maya tried to scream, but his hand muffled any sound as he dragged her toward a black sedan idling at the curb. Her feet scrambled for purchase on the sidewalk, her hands clawing at his arm. But Derek had always been stronger than her, had always used his physical advantage to remind her of her helplessness. Now, Derek said as she struggled, his grip tightening until she could barely breathe. "None of that fighting. You know how much it annoys me when you make scenes in public." The casual cruelty in his voice, the way he spoke as if her terror were a minor inconvenience rather than a life-threatening situation, triggered every survival instinct Maya had developed during their relationship. She forced herself to stop struggling, knowing that resistance would only escalate his violence, and focused instead on memorizing details that might help if she survived long enough to escape. The sedan's license plate was partially obscured with mud, but she caught enough numbers to remember. Derek was wearing his off-duty clothes, but still had his police radio clipped to his belt, probably planning to use his law enforcement status to explain away any interference. He wasn't alone. She could see at least one other figure in the driver's seat, someone who kept the engine running while Derek wrestled her into the back seat. "Good girl," Derek said as she stopped fighting, his hand finally releasing her mouth as he shoved her across the leather seats. "I knew you'd remember how this works eventually." Maya's mind raced as the car pulled into traffic, carrying her away from the only safety she'd known in months. Adriana would discover her missing when she didn't return from the pharmacy, but Derek had probably planned for that. He was smart, calculating, had spent 2 years learning exactly how to anticipate and counter her attempts to escape his control. But Maya wasn't the same broken woman who'd fled Seattle 6 months ago. Living on the streets had taught her things about survival that her privileged professional life never could have. Adriano's protection had given her space to remember her own strength, to realize that Derek's power over her had been based on isolation and psychological manipulation rather than any fundamental weakness on her part. "Where are you taking me?" Maya asked, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Somewhere private where we can talk," Derek replied, his tone conversational, as if kidnapping her off the street were a reasonable approach to relationship communication. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, Maya. Cost me friends, damaged my reputation, made me look like the kind of man who can't control his own woman." "I'm not your woman," Maya said quietly, testing his reaction. Derek's hand shot out faster than she could dodge, the backhanded slap sending stars across her vision and the familiar taste of blood into her mouth. But instead of the crushing despair that blow would have triggered 6 months ago, Maya felt something different rise in her chest. Rage. Pure, clean anger that burned away the fear and reminded her that she was not Derek's victim anymore. She was under the protection of a man who commanded respect through strength rather than intimidation, who had shown her what real power looked like when it was used to protect rather than control. Adriana would come for her. She knew that with absolute certainty. But she didn't have to wait helplessly for rescue. The car turned into what looked like an abandoned industrial area, probably somewhere Derek had scouted in advance for privacy and easy body disposal. Maya's heart rate spiked as the implications of their destination became clear, but she forced herself to stay calm, to think tactically rather than emotionally. Derek's gun was holstered on his right side, covered by his jacket, but accessible if she could get close enough. His backup piece would be on his ankle, standard police positioning that she'd learned about during her domestic violence advocacy training. The driver hadn't spoken or looked back, suggesting he might be hired help rather than law enforcement, which meant unknown variables in terms of weapons and training. As the car stopped in front of a warehouse that looked like it had been abandoned for years, Maya made her decision. She wasn't going to die as Derek's victim. If this ended badly, it would end with her fighting back. Derek dragged her from the car with unnecessary force, his grip on her arm tight enough to leave bruises that would match the pattern she remembered from their relationship. But as he marched her toward the warehouse entrance, Maya noticed something that gave her hope: his overconfidence. Derek thought he was dealing with the same terrified woman who'd been too broken to fight back effectively. He had no idea that 6 months of survival had taught her things about desperation and resourcefulness that her previous sheltered life never could have. He didn't know that she'd spent weeks training with Adriano's security team, learning basic self-defense because he'd insisted that everyone in his household be prepared for dangerous situations. Most importantly, Derek had no idea that Maya Chun was no longer alone in the world, no longer isolated and dependent on systems that had failed her. She belonged to a family now, a family that would move heaven and earth to bring her home safely. Inside the warehouse, Derek shoved her into a metal chair and began securing her wrists with zip ties, his movements efficient and practiced in a way that suggested he'd done this before. Maya submitted to the restraints without resistance, letting him believe she was as helpless as he remembered while she studied her surroundings for advantages. The warehouse was mostly empty except for some old machinery and scattered debris, with high windows that let in dusty shafts of afternoon light. There were multiple exits, but Derek positioned himself between her and the most obvious escape routes. His backup had remained with the car, probably watching for pursuit or law enforcement response. "Now then," Derek said, settling into another chair facing her with the patient demeanor of someone who had all the time in the world. "Let's discuss your future, Maya. You've had your little adventure, proved whatever point you thought you were making, but this ends now. You're coming home with me where you belong." Maya looked directly into his eyes, no longer afraid to meet his gaze the way she'd been during their relationship. "I'm never going back with you," she said clearly. "I'd rather die first." Derek's expression darkened at her defiance, his hand moving automatically toward his weapon. "That can be arranged," he said, his reasonable tone never changing despite the threat. "But think about your new boyfriend and his son. It would be a shame if your stubbornness resulted in unfortunate accidents for people you care about." The threat against Luca and Adriano sent fresh rage through Maya's system, burning away any remaining traces of the fear Derek had used to control her for so long. He was threatening her family, the people who had given her a reason to want to live again, and that was unforgivable. Maya began working at the zip ties binding her wrists, using a technique one of Adriano's men had taught her during their informal training sessions. The plastic cut into her skin as she twisted and manipulated the restraints, but pain was irrelevant when the lives of people she loved were at stake. "You always were too stupid to know what was good for you," Derek continued, standing to pace in front of her with agitation that suggested his plan wasn't proceeding as smoothly as he'd hoped. "Did you really think some Italian gangster would want damaged goods like you permanently? Men like that use women like you and throw them away when they're bored." His words were designed to break her spirit, to convince her that Adriano's protection was temporary and that returning to Derek was her only real option. 6 months ago, they might have worked. But Maya had seen the way Adriano looked at her, had felt the tenderness in his touch when he thought she was asleep, had heard him include her in his definition of family without hesitation. Derek was wrong about everything that mattered, and Maya was done letting his twisted perception of reality define her world. The zip ties finally gave way just as Derek turned his back to check his phone, probably expecting updates from his backup outside. Maya slipped free of the restraints silently, her movements careful and controlled as she calculated distances and angles. When Derek turned back around, Maya was ready. She launched herself from the chair with all the force she could muster, driving her shoulder into his solar plexus and sending him staggering backward. Before he could recover, Maya grabbed for his service weapon, her fingers closing around the grip just as Derek realized what was happening. They struggled for control of the gun, Derek's superior strength initially giving him the advantage, but Maya had desperation and rage fueling her efforts. More importantly, she had something Derek had never possessed, the absolute certainty that she was fighting for something worth dying for. The gun went off during their struggle, the bullet embedding harmlessly in the warehouse ceiling. But the sound seemed to snap something in Derek's control. His free hand closed around Maya's throat with killing force, his eyes holding the same cold calculation she remembered from the worst nights of their relationship. But just as Maya's vision started to gray around the edges, the warehouse doors exploded inward with a crash that seemed to shake the entire building. Armed figures in expensive suits poured through multiple entrances simultaneously, their weapons trained on Derek with professional precision. Adriano appeared in the main doorway like an avenging angel, his face a mask of controlled fury that made him look nothing like the gentle man who cooked breakfast and helped his son with homework. This was the other side of his nature, the part that ruled a dangerous world through strength and absolute determination, and Maya had never been more grateful to see anyone in her entire life. "Let her go," Adriano said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made grown men reconsider their life choices. Now, Derek's hand tightened on Maya's throat for one terrifying moment, his eyes wild with the desperation of someone whose carefully planned revenge had collapsed around him. But facing a dozen armed professionals who looked like they would be delighted to demonstrate their marksmanship skills, even Derek's arrogance wasn't enough to sustain his resistance. He released Maya and raised his hands slowly, his police training finally overriding his rage enough to recognize when he was completely outmatched. Maya collapsed to her knees, gasping for air and touching her bruised throat, while Adriano's men efficiently secured Derek and his backup. Adriano reached Maya in 3 quick strides, his hands gentle as he helped her to her feet, and checked her injuries with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly how close he'd come to losing something irreplaceable. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotions he was fighting to control. "Did he hurt you?" Maya shook her head, not trusting her voice yet, and let herself lean into Adriano's strength as the full impact of her ordeal hit her. She was safe. Derek would never threaten her again. She had fought back and survived, and the man she loved had moved heaven and earth to find her. "Take care of this," Adriano said to his men, his tone making it clear that Derek's future was not going to involve further opportunities to hurt anyone. "Make sure he understands the consequences of threatening my family." Maya didn't ask what those consequences would be, and she didn't feel any guilt about Derek's fate. He had made his choices, had escalated to kidnapping and attempted murder, and now he would face the kind of justice that operated outside the failed system Maya had once trusted. The ride back to the penthouse passed in a blur of Adriano's protective presence and the gradual release of adrenaline that left Maya feeling exhausted and strangely euphoric. She had survived Derek's final gambit, had fought back successfully, had proven to herself that she was no longer the helpless victim he'd tried to create. More than that, she had seen Adriano's response when she was threatened, the way he'd mobilized his entire organization without hesitation to bring her home safely. Whatever else happened between them, she knew with absolute certainty that this was a man who kept his promises, who protected what was his with unwavering dedication. Back in the safety of Adriano's home, Maya found herself shaking as the full emotional impact of the day caught up with her. She'd come so close to losing everything she'd found here, so close to letting Derek destroy the new life she'd built from nothing. Adriano led her to his bedroom rather than the guest room she'd been using, and Maya didn't protest the presumption. She didn't want to be alone tonight, didn't want to give Derek's memory any more power over her than he'd already taken. "Maya," Adriano said as she sat on the edge of his bed, still trembling with reaction. "Look at me." When she met his eyes, Maya saw her own emotions reflected there: relief, residual fear, and something deeper that made her breath catch in her throat. "I thought I'd lost you," Adriano said simply. "When I realized he'd taken you, when I didn't know if I'd find you in time, I understood something I've been trying not to acknowledge." Maya's heart began to race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear as Adriano moved closer, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite gentleness. "I'm in love with you," he said, the words carrying absolute certainty. Not just grateful, not just protective, but completely, irrevocably in love with the woman who saved my son and then saved herself. Maya felt tears spill over at his declaration, at the impossible gift of being loved by someone like Adriano Torino. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice shaky but clear. "I was so afraid I'd never get to tell you." When Adriano kissed her, it was with the desperate passion of someone who'd almost lost everything that mattered. Maya kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring all of her gratitude and relief and love into the connection between them. This time, there were no interruptions, no hesitation, no doubt about what they both wanted. Maya let Adriano show her with touch and whispered words exactly how precious she was to him, how completely she belonged in his world and in his bed. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Maya felt truly safe in the arms of someone who would never let anything hurt her again. 6 months later, Maya stood in the reception area of the newly opened Chun Foundation Community Center, watching as families who reminded her of her former self found resources and support they'd thought were impossible to access. The storefront in Little Italy had been Adriano's idea, a way to combine her passion for social work with his family's connections and resources to create something that actually helped people rather than shuffling them through endless bureaucratic processes. The morning had already brought 3 success stories: a mother escaping domestic violence who now had safe housing and legal representation, a veteran struggling with addiction who'd been connected with specialized treatment, and a teenager aging out of foster care who'd received job training placement and transitional housing. These were the victories Maya had dreamed of achieving during her professional career, the kind of real change that happened when you had the right resources and the determination to cut through red tape. Maya glanced at the framed photo on her desk showing her with Adriano and Luca at the center's opening ceremony 3 weeks ago. In the picture, she was wearing a designer dress that fit perfectly and cost more than her monthly salary used to be, her hair professionally styled, and her smile radiant with genuine happiness. But it was the way Adriano looked at her in the photo that still made her breath catch, like she was the most precious thing in his world. "Mom," Luca called from across the center, where he was helping sort donated children's books for the literacy program. "Can I put the dinosaur books in the special section?" The casual way he'd started calling her mom still made Maya's heart skip, still felt like a gift she'd never quite earned but treasured beyond measure. Since Derek's final elimination 6 months ago, Luca had grown from a child who called her by her first name to one who introduced her to his friends as his mom, without any qualification or explanation. "Of course, sweetheart," Maya replied, watching with satisfaction as he carefully organized the books according to the system they'd developed together. "You remember how we talked about making sure the youngest kids can reach the picture books?" Luca nodded seriously, his concentration on the task reminding Maya of his father's focused attention to detail. At 9 years old, he was already showing signs of the leadership qualities that would serve him well in whatever future he chose, whether that involved the family business or something completely different. The afternoon passed quickly with client consultations, coordination calls with partner organizations, and the satisfying work of connecting people with resources that could genuinely change their circumstances. Maya had discovered that her years of traditional social work, combined with her first-hand experience of homelessness and abuse, gave her unique insight into what people actually needed versus what the system typically offered. More importantly, Adriano's reputation and connections meant that when Maya called requesting assistance for a client, people responded immediately and comprehensively. Landlords who might normally discriminate found themselves motivated to provide fair housing. Employers who typically avoided hiring people with complicated backgrounds suddenly discovered the value of second chances. Legal aid organizations that were usually overbooked found time to take cases that mattered. Maya had learned not to ask too many questions about the exact mechanisms behind these miraculous attitude adjustments. Some conversations were better left to her imagination. By 6 o'clock, when Maya and Luca arrived home at the penthouse, she was pleasantly tired in the way that came from meaningful work rather than mere survival. The home that had once seemed impossibly luxurious now felt simply like home, the place where she belonged with the people who mattered most. Adriano was in the kitchen as usual, but tonight he was joined by his mother Lucia and Maya's sister Sarah, who'd flown in from Seattle for what they described as an important family dinner. Maya had reconnected with Sarah shortly after Derek's death, tentatively rebuilding the relationship that Derek's manipulation had nearly destroyed. Sarah's presence tonight suggested this gathering had significance beyond their usual weekly family meal. "There she is," Lucia announced with satisfaction as Maya and Luca entered the kitchen. "The woman of the hour." "What's the occasion?" Maya asked, noting the expensive champagne chilling on the counter and the elaborate table setting in the dining room that was normally reserved for major holidays. "Can't a man cook a special dinner for the woman he loves?" Adriano asked, but there was something in his expression that suggested tonight was indeed different from their usual evenings. Sarah was practically vibrating with excitement as they sat down to dinner, and even Luca seemed to know something important was happening, his usual chatter replaced by expectant silence. Maya looked around the table at the people who had become her family, wondering what they were all clearly anticipating. The dinner conversation flowed around Maya's work at the foundation, Luca's upcoming school play, and Sarah's new job in social services that she'd pursued, partly inspired by Maya's example. But Maya could feel an undercurrent of anticipation that suggested the evening's real purpose hadn't yet been revealed. It wasn't until dessert that Adriano stood, his expression suddenly serious in a way that made Maya's heart begin to race. 6 months ago, Adriano began, his voice carrying the formal tone he used for important pronouncements. A woman I'd never met threw herself between armed killers and my son without hesitation. She saved Luca's life, and in doing so, she saved mine as well. Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks as everyone at the table turned to look at her with expressions of love and admiration. She still wasn't comfortable being the center of attention, still sometimes felt like she was playing a role in someone else's life rather than living her own. But what I didn't understand that day, Adriano continued, was that she wasn't just saving our lives. She was completing our family, filling a space we didn't even know was empty until she arrived. Adriano moved to stand beside Maya's chair, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as he spoke directly to her. You've made me remember what it feels like to be happy, not just content or grateful, but genuinely happy about the future. You've given Luca a mother who loves him unconditionally and shows him every day what strength and compassion look like. You've made our house a home. Maya's breath caught as Adriano dropped to one knee beside her chair, producing a ring box that looked like it contained something spectacular. Maya-chan, will you marry me? Will you officially become the mother Luca already considers you to be? Will you let me spend the rest of my life protecting and cherishing you the way you deserve? Maya looked down at the ring he revealed, a stunning emerald surrounded by diamonds that probably cost more than most people's houses. But it was the expression on his face that made tears spill down her cheeks. He was looking at her with absolute love and certainty, like her answer was the most important thing in the world. Yes, Maya whispered, then cleared her throat and said it louder. Yes, of course yes. The table erupted in celebration as Adriano slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her with the passion of someone who'd just secured his heart's greatest desire. Luca cheered with delight, Sarah wiped away happy tears, and Lucia looked supremely satisfied, as if she'd orchestrated the entire evening's events. When I told Papa I wanted you to be my real mom, Luca announced proudly. He said he was already working on it. Maya laughed through her tears, pulling Luca into a hug, while still holding tight to Adriano's hand. Real mom, she repeated. I like the sound of that. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of wedding planning discussions and family celebration, but what struck Maya most was how natural it all felt. This wasn't just a romantic engagement. It was the formalization of a family unit that had been functioning perfectly for months. Later, as Maya and Adriano lay together in their bed with her engagement ring catching moonlight from the windows, Maya marveled at how completely her life had transformed. I still can't quite believe this is real, Maya admitted, turning the ring on her finger and watching it sparkle. 6 months ago, I was sleeping behind dumpsters and wondering if I'd survive another week on the streets. And now you're going to be my wife, Adriano said, his arm tightening around her. Mrs. Maya Torino has a nice ring to it. Maya smiled at the thought of taking his name, of officially belonging to the family that had already claimed her so completely. Mrs. Maya Torino, she repeated experimentally. I love it. There's something else, Adriano said quietly, his hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. Something I've been hoping to discuss with you. Maya felt her breath catch as she understood his implication. They'd been careful about birth control, but careful wasn't the same as preventing, and there had been a few occasions when passion had overruled practicality. How long have you known? Adriano asked gently. About a week, Maya admitted. I was waiting for the right moment to tell you. Are you happy about it? Adriano's answering kiss was soft and reverent, his hand spreading protectively over her abdomen. I'm thrilled, he said against her lips. Luca's been asking for a baby brother or sister since the engagement party planning started. Maya laughed at the image of their future expanding to include more children, more chaos, more love than she'd ever imagined possible. A year ago, she'd been convinced that she was too broken for love, too damaged for family, too lost for redemption. Now she was engaged to a man who moved mountains for her happiness, mother to a child who loved her unconditionally, pregnant with a baby who would grow up knowing nothing but safety and devotion, and professionally fulfilled in ways that her previous career had never achieved. 3 weeks later, Maya found herself walking through the same little Italy alley where her new life had begun, but this time she wasn't seeking shelter or hiding from threats. She was delivering supplies to a homeless woman named Rosa who reminded her painfully of her former self. Rosa was probably in her 30s, though homelessness had aged her in the way Maya remembered too well. Her clothes were clean but worn, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her eyes held the same wariness Maya had carried for months after escaping Derek. "I brought you some things," Maya said gently, setting down a bag containing warm clothes, toiletries, nutritious food, and information about the Chun Foundation's emergency housing program. "No strings attached, just help if you want it." Rosa looked at Maya with obvious suspicion, probably wondering what the catch was. Maya remembered that feeling, the bone-deep certainty that kindness always came with a price that would be revealed when you were most vulnerable. "I used to sleep right there," Maya said, pointing to the spot behind the dumpster where she'd hidden 6 months ago. "I know what it's like to wonder if anyone would notice if you disappeared, to feel like you're invisible to everyone who passes by." Rosa's expression shifted slightly, recognition replacing suspicion as she processed the fact that this well-dressed woman with expensive jewelry and obvious resources had actually shared her experience. "What happened to you?" Rosa asked cautiously. "How did you get out?" Maya smiled at the question, thinking about everything that had led from that desperate night to this moment of being able to help someone else find hope. "Someone saw me when I needed to be seen," Maya said simply. "Someone believed I was worth saving, even when I didn't believe it myself. And then I learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let people help you." She handed Rosa a business card for the Chun Foundation along with her personal phone number. "When you're ready to try something different, call me," Maya said. "No pressure, no judgment, just options you might not know you have." As Maya walked away from the alley where her transformation had begun, she felt the baby moving gently in her growing belly and thought about the wedding dress hanging in her closet, about Luca's excitement about becoming a big brother, about Adriano's absolute devotion that still took her breath away. But mostly she thought about the power of second chances, about what could happen when someone refused to let you give up on yourself. Rosa might call the foundation tomorrow, or next week, or never, but she would know that someone cared enough to offer genuine help without conditions. And sometimes that knowledge alone was enough to plant the seed of hope that could grow into real change. Maya had learned that healing wasn't a destination but a journey, that love could bloom in the most unexpected circumstances, and that sometimes the worst experiences in life were just preparation for the most beautiful ones that followed. What did you think of Maya's transformation? Have you ever had someone believe in you when you couldn't believe in yourself? Sometimes the most important thing we can do is show up for people who are struggling to find their way back to hope. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this story, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about love, resilience, and the amazing things that happen when we refuse to give up on each other.